Thank you so much, Jess, and thanks everyone who's able to be here today or who's viewing this later online. My name is Kate Kavanaugh, and I am an assistant professor at Michigan State University with affiliations in both the School of Criminal Justice and the Department of Psychology. I'm actually a developmental psychologist by training, and I specialize in adolescent development at the nexus of justice system contact. So I'm really excited to present today because I'm really hoping to have some conversation about how to be more engaged with the community in the research that I do. So today I'm going to be talking about one of the primary areas of my research that I've been focused on for the last several years, which is the role of parents in youth's probationary success and recidivism after a juvenile is arrested. Oh no. Let's see. There we go. So just a quick outline for the things I'll cover today. I'm going to start with a very fast kind of primer on adolescent risk-taking. It's important to understand some of the background on adolescent development and risk-taking before we start talking about adolescence in the context of the justice system. Then I'm going to introduce the Crossroads study, which is a large 3-site longitudinal study from which all of the papers that I'll be presenting today come from. So that way I'll just introduce the study once at the beginning, and I won't have to keep reminding you about the methodology as I report the results. The rest of the talk is divided into 2 sections. The first I like to think of as parents with an arrow toward youth reoffending. So the way that the parenting context affects youth reoffending after youth have already been arrested. And in this section, I'll talk about things like attitudes toward the justice system, knowledge and participation in youth's legal process, and the way that family factors affect legal decision making. The other half of the talk will be essentially the arrow going the opposite way. So how does youth reoffending affect the family context? And here I'll talk about the role of youth rearrests and youth delinquency on parent-child relationship quality and parents' aspirations for their children's future. So let's start with just a quick primer on adolescent risk-taking. We know that adolescence is a time of immense physical, social, and psychological transition. Any of you who have either worked with adolescents or perhaps you remember from your own adolescence know that this is definitely the case. But one of the areas where the most development takes place is in cognitive development, and this is harder for us to see than things like puberty. However, during adolescence, youth develop an improved capacity to use logic. Sometimes adolescents are described as really argumentative, and that's because they're for the first time able to think about things abstractly, reason through them logically, and they're trying to use that muscle. They're not just trying to be a little junior lawyer. We also know that several changes in the structure of the brain happen during adolescence, which result in increased neural processing speed. So adolescents are better able to kind of think through decisions and think more quickly. However, another thing that criminologists know to be true about adolescents is that they engage in a lot of crime. What I'm showing you here is called the age crime curve. And what we've got on the x-axis is age from early adolescence into later adulthood. And on the y-axis, we've got crimes per 100 of the population, so crime rate. And you can see that between about the ages of maybe 14 and 20, both violent and nonviolent crime peaks. And what's really interesting about the age crime curve is that it seems to be true for both males and females. That's what I'm showing you here. You see the same spike. For various cultures, this in particular happens to be comparing a European sample to a Caribbean sample. And across time, so here we're looking at the 1990s, the 2000s, 2010, in terms of different types of crime, we see the same spike. And in fact, this pattern, this age crime curve, has been documented across cultures since the 1800s. So it's one of the most well-known features of crime in criminology is that crime seems to peak during adolescence. But this presents a paradox, right? I just told you all of the ways that adolescents are so smart. But if they're so smart, if they're having all these great new cognitive skills, then why do they do such stupid things sometimes? We know that adolescents are more prone to risk-taking than adults are. And my area of interest is in contact with the law. So I like to conceptualize that as a very specific type of risk-taking that results in an arrest. Well, some researchers suggest that the reason that crime and risk-taking generally peaks during adolescence is because there is a gap between youth's cognitive functioning and psychosocial functioning. So again, on the x-axis, we've got age, and on the y-axis, we've got % of the sample scoring at mean adult levels. Now, the red line here represents intellectual ability, so some of those more basic cognitive things that I was talking about before. And we know that intellectual ability reaches adult levels by the time youth are about 16 years old. But the blue line represents psychosocial development. That means things like impulse control, planning for the future, so not being as oriented towards sensation seeking and rewards. We know that those psychosocial capacities continue developing into early adulthood, into maybe the mid to even late 20s. And so what this creates is a gap that coincides really nicely with that age crime curve. It's right about between age 14 and maybe 22, where we see crime to be spiking. And it's a gap between youth's intellectual functioning and their psychosocial functioning. A really interesting way to think about this is that it's like having a car that works perfectly, but a driver who isn't trained to drive it. So if the intellectual ability is the car, it's a brand new car, it's got gas in the tank, but the psychosocial development is the driver, the person making the decisions, then it doesn't matter how nice and new the car is, you're likely to crash. And so some theorists suggest that this is why risk-taking and crime peak during adolescence, because they have the intellectual capacities, but not the psychosocial capacities to prevent them from engaging in risk. And in fact, this has been recognized by the Supreme Court in several landmark decisions over the past 10 years. For example, Roper v. Simmons, which abolished the juvenile death penalty, more recently Graham and Miller, which were cases relevant to juvenile life without parole. And so in these cases, the Supreme Court cited in their decision this adolescent development research and the fact that we know that psychosocial development lags behind intellectual development in a way that makes youth more prone to risk-taking and criminal behavior. Great. So I always like to kind of give an example. I'll take you on a narrative here. So imagine that you are this kid. Maybe you're 15 years old, you're walking home from school one day, you're with a group of friends, you're kind of messing around, taking your time walking home, and somebody says, you know what would be fun is if we spray painted this building. And you're like, okay, yeah, that would be fun. Now we know this is how a lot of adolescent crime unfolds. Usually it's an impulsive decision that happens in a group with friends. Usually it's something kind of low level like vandalism. A lot of times it's a property crime. So we know this is a pretty typical situation. However, unfortunately, today the police are driving by and they arrest you. What is one of the first things that's going to happen? If you're this kid, you're probably thinking, how are my parents going to react? And if you're the law enforcement agent, you're probably thinking, okay, now we've got to get in touch with this kid's parents. So we know that because adolescent offenders are, by dint of their age, minors, that parents are thought to be an important and critical part of their arrest process. And so my program of research is interested in the downstream and reciprocal effects of youth's family environment on their justice system contact. Okay, I'm going to introduce the Crossroads study. Again, this is a large longitudinal study from which the data for all the rest of the information I'll present come. So I'm going to pause after I introduce the Crossroads study to see if people have any questions about the sample. Crossroads is a longitudinal study of 312 pairs of juvenile offenders and their mothers. So we're talking about 624 participants total. Youth were all male first-time offenders, and they were recruited from 3 geographically and ethnically diverse parts of the United States, so Southern California, New Orleans, and Philadelphia. The reason that we only included males in this particular study, which I understand is certainly a weakness, is just because of the fact that male adolescents are much more likely to have contact with the justice system than females, and so just as a recruitment strategy, we stuck with males. Youth were interviewed for 2 to 3 hours face-to-face using computer-assisted software, semi-annually over 7 years. This is an ongoing study, so I think the farthest out I'm going to present today is 3 years, but know that the data collection has continued and is continuing. Most of the youth who were recruited for the study were involved in kind of what we'd consider low to moderate level crimes. So the eligibility characteristics were that youth had to have been arrested for a crime that would not necessarily just get them a slap on the wrist, but wouldn't necessarily get them transferred to adult court. So most youth in the study had been arrested for things like drug possession, assault and battery, vandalism, theft, etc. Moms were eligible to participate if they were the primary female guardian of enrolled youth. And what surprised me while conducting this study was that 91% were biological mothers. So we asked youth, who is mainly in charge of taking care of you? And we found that about 85% of them listed a female instead of a male. So that's why we went with primary female guardian instead of male guardian. Again, I understand that that's certainly a limitation of this study, and it would be interesting to look at fathers as well. But because most of the youth in the study suggested that their primary caretaker was a woman, that's what we went with. So of the 91% who were biological mothers, the other 9% might be things like a grandma, an aunt, a foster mom, an adoptive mom, etc. And any inferential statistics I'm going to show you today did not change when we considered only biological mothers. Moms were interviewed over the telephone, again using computer-assisted software in either English or in Spanish by a native-speaking research assistant. And moms were only interviewed twice. So while youth were interviewed semi-annually, moms were interviewed twice. First at baseline, right after their son's first arrest, and then 3 years later. And that's what we're calling time 2. So if I talk about time 1 and time 2 for the mom participants, I'm talking about baseline and then 3 years later. Youth were between 13 and 17 when they enrolled in the study. Moms' ages ranged from 33 to 70. That 70-year-old was a grandma, so she was part of that 9% that wasn't a biological mother. And to nobody's surprise, since most were biological relations, mother's racial identity and youth racial identity looked very similar. What I want to draw your attention to, however, here is that this was a heavily Black and Latino sample, which had to do with where we recruited. So remember, these were samples pulled from Philadelphia, New Orleans, and Southern California. And this more or less represents the distribution of youth in the juvenile justice system in those areas. Before I move on, I can't see the chat box, so I guess Jessica will have to tell me, are there any questions about the sample, about how we did sampling, why we did sampling this way? Any questions with regards to the sample?
There aren't any questions that popped up in the chat box, but I actually have 2 questions.
Great.
So one's related to the specific sample, and then one's back around the age crime curve. So the first question I had was how the specific locales were selected. You just said Philly, New Orleans,
and yeah, in Southern California. Those were selected because they were places with kind of a good racial and ethnic distribution of juvenile justice, and also because they were some PIs who had worked together before, and because there are some various laws in those states in the way that youth are processed. So when youth enter the juvenile justice system, they might be processed informally, which means their case is mostly handled at probation, or they might be processed formally, which means the district attorney decides that the case should go in front of a judge. And so these 3 locations had some variability in the ways that they decided whether a case should be processed formally or informally, which was one of the research questions for the study at large, was how are processing decisions made?
Thank you. And then the question I had about the age crime curve, and I'm sure it's one you get all the time, is just the source of those data. And so is it actually, to what extent is it crime truly peaking during that time versus perhaps over-policing of this particular age group?
Great question. I'm so glad you asked, and I wish I had an extra backup slide for that. So if you compare the official arrest rates, then it looks like crime peaks closer to around the age 20. But if you look at self-reported offending, then crime peaks a little bit earlier, more like 16. And so it's hard to disentangle your question, right? But we do know that the age crime curve shifts a little bit to the left toward a younger age if we are looking at self-report data versus official record data.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful. Do any of the other folks that are on the call have any questions they want to check in with now? All right, back to you, Kate. Thanks.
Cool. Okay. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to this first section where I'm looking at the way that the parenting context affects youth offending. So remember, these are all juvenile offenders, all first-time offenders. So when I talk about offending, I'm really talking about reoffending. These are youth who have had a first arrest, and that's a really critical decision point for juvenile justice, is after your first arrest, was it a one-time mistake, or is this the beginning of kind of a pattern? So we're looking at reoffending after a youth's first arrest. So the first set of studies I'm going to present to you, I really borrowed pretty heavily from the education literature. So if we have any education people, then some of this research might sound familiar to you. So in the education literature, we know that parental support is related to youth success in school. And there's a couple of different domains in which this is true. So the first is attitude. We know that parents who feel that school is important, who try to instill school as a value to their children, we know that those kids are more likely to achieve academic success. We also know that parents having a solid knowledge of the school system also helps youth success. So parents who know who their child's teacher is, for example, know why SAT prep is important. Those sorts of bits of knowledge surrounding the academic context are associated with youth success. And the third one is effort. So we know that parents who are putting in more effort, the parents who attend parent-teacher conferences, the parents who make sure homework is getting done, those parents are more likely to have kids who do well in school. And so I was curious about the way that some of these factors might translate to youth success on probation. So is it the same thing that parental support on probation leads to youth success, whereas here we're considering youth success to be crime desistance the first year after your arrest? So for example, do the parents who have an attitude that law enforcement is fair and efficacious and that it's important to follow the law, are their children more likely to desist from crime? For knowledge, are parents who have a better understanding of how to navigate the juvenile justice system, did their kids do better at desisting from crime? And then for effort, are the parents who are more participatory in their child's legal process, are their children more likely to desist from crime after a year? So I'm going to take these one at a time. So first, when I talk about attitudes, here I'm pulling from the procedural justice literature. So when I talk about parents having a positive attitude toward the justice system, that's a sense that the justice system is fair, it's efficacious, it's legitimate. The reason that this matters is because we know that parents' attitudes shape youth attitudes, but there's been very little done to determine how youth develop attitudes toward the justice system. This is called legal socialization. And so I was interested in the extent to which parents' attitudes shaping youth attitudes might explain how youth develop attitudes toward the justice system. For example, we know that parents' attitudes toward religion, gender roles, politics, any of those big attitudinal or value statement things really shape their children's attitudes. So we're interested if the same thing was true for children's attitudes toward the justice system. The reason that this matters is because when people do not find the justice system to be legitimate, they feel more justified in breaking the law, which they perceive to be unfair, which makes sense, which means they're more likely to engage in crime. So as people begin to feel that the justice system is less legitimate, they are more likely to either offend or to recidivate. So that's why it's important to determine how kids learn about the justice system, how kids feel about the justice system, et cetera. So here I'm showing you a big, nasty SEM model. I'm doing this in case we have some stats nerds here who want to take a look at it. But for everyone else who is more interested in the narrative, getting to the good stuff, what we found, I am just going to kind of gray out some of the covariates here. So what I want you to take from this is that when mothers had a more positive attitude toward the justice systems, so did their sons. And when sons had a more positive attitude toward the justice system, they were less likely to reoffend within that first year after their arrest. And here we looked at self-reported offending because we found that youth were self-reporting offending at a much higher rate than they were actually getting rearrested, although the same pattern was true if we looked at official arrest records. And what was interesting was there was also an indirect pathway from mothers' attitudes directly or indirectly toward youth self-reportive offending. And so it's not just that mothers' attitudes toward the justice system shape their child's attitudes, but also that those child's justice system attitudes has important implications for their reoffending behavior. Okay, but the way that parents feel about the justice system is different than what they actually know about the justice system. So I was interested in measuring what parents actually know about how the justice system functions. And this research really came out of a conversation I had with a few people at probation at one of the research sites. And they were trying to tell me, you know, the parents just don't care, that's why they don't show up. And I said, well, could it be that they don't know that they're supposed to show up? I mean, you work in probation, so you know how it's supposed to go. But if your kid's been arrested for the first time, other people out there might not know how the process works. And so I worked with the Department of Probation to create a list of 44 items that probation said this is what parents absolutely have to know in order to successfully navigate the system. And the probation officers I was working with were kind of saying, everyone's going to know this stuff, it's going to be fine. And I'm like, we'll see. So we administered this to parents as to the mothers in the study as a true-false test. So we reworded all of these important bits of information about about how to navigate the juvenile justice system as true-false questions. And then we administered all of these items to the moms, and we graded it just as you would grade a test. So just for some sample questions, here I'm showing you some of the most frequently missed questions. So things like, if I, as the parent, pay for a lawyer for my son, then I get to decide how he will plead. Only 27% of people correctly said that that was false. That's not true. One that was really interesting to me, because I've seen it come up a lot anecdotally, was moms often got this one wrong. They would say, conversations I have with my son's probation officer are confidential or private. The answer to that is false, but most parents don't know that. They think that it's the same, their relationship with the probation officer is the same as their relationship with an attorney. So they think that there is a promise of confidentiality. So what often happens is the probation officer will stop by the house, and the parent will say something like, I'm really worried that he is dealing drugs again. I'm not sure, like he hasn't been keeping curfew. And so then the probation officer will find the kid, do a random drug test. If the kid drops dirty, now he's violated his probation and will be arrested again. And then the parent says, how dare you? I trusted you. I didn't think that you were going to go test my kid, because the parents didn't understand that these conversations were not confidential. Another really interesting one that I find that a lot of lay people get wrong is that juvenile records are automatically sealed. That's not true. So a lot of parents assumed that after their child was arrested, the record would be sealed and there was nothing else they had to do about that. That's not true. Usually there's a process you have to go to request that the records are sealed. In some places, there's a fine or a fee that you have to pay to make that happen. So these are just some examples. There are 44 items total. And this is how parents scored. So here I've truncated at the end 0% correct to 39% correct, but otherwise the x-axis is your score on this true-false test, and then the y-axis is the number of women who scored in that way. And so what we found, I am a professor, and if this is what my midterm distribution looked like, I would not be super happy. So the average score was about a 66% correct, and the range was from 39% correct to 93% correct, although I will say the woman who got a 93% correct was herself a paralegal, so she had a leg up on some of the other women in the study. Since this was a true-false test, scoring below 50% meant you scored below chance, and we had some women who scored below chance. So in general, parents didn't know a lot of this information that the Department of Probation goes into these interactions assuming that they absolutely definitely know. What I was interested in was the moms who scored below the mean, so the moms who scored below average on this test. And perhaps unsurprisingly, what I found was that these women were more likely to be minority or non-white race. They were more likely to be non-English speakers or non-native English speakers. They were more likely to be in the lowest third of income, and also the lowest third in education within the sample. So these are the very families that we would consider to be most at risk for reoffending and for continued justice system contact, but they're the ones who might not have the parental knowledge backing them up as far as how to navigate the justice system. So the last thing I want to talk about for this section is effort. So I was interested in the degree to which parents were participating in their children's legal proceedings. So how much were they participating when their child got arrested? So again, we asked moms a series of questions about ways they could have participated in their child's legal proceedings. And for the most part, they were participating with a lot of these things, meeting with lawyers, going to court dates, helping with probation requirements, meeting with probation officers. Not very many were giving their children advice, although now that I know how low their knowledge is, that's probably a good thing. But what was more interesting to me was, of the moms who said no, we always asked why not. And time again, what we would find is that mom said, I had to work, I couldn't get off work, I didn't have transportation, I had taken too many days off of work already, it's too far away from where my job is, I couldn't find childcare. So there are these structural barriers that were preventing parents from showing up, even if they wanted to, and even if they knew that they were supposed to. So I was interested in the way that this idea of parents' knowledge toward the justice system related to their effort or their legal participation in their child's legal proceedings. Again, here's a nasty SEM for the stats nerds like me who want to take a look at everything that's in the model. But for right now, I'm just going to draw your attention to the main story. So we found a main effect of moms' legal knowledge on reoffending, such that the moms who knew the least about the justice system had kids who were more likely to reoffend a year later. And we also found a main effect for mothers' legal participation. So the moms who were participating less, their children were more likely to reoffend. But we also found that about 42% of the effect of mom's knowledge on youth recidivism was mediated through mother's effort, suggesting a cascade where the moms who knew the least then participated the least, and their children were most likely to reoffend. My take-home message on this section before I take some questions is that parents can help their children succeed on probation if they have the tools to do so. And that means that it's important for law enforcement to treat families respectfully, and it's important that the court system, whether it's the Department of Probation or whatever the first point of contact is for families, help to educate parents as far as what their rights and responsibilities are, because most don't know. And it's also important to create meaningful and possible ways for parents to be involved. A lot of parents would like to be more involved, and there simply are structural barriers that are preventing them from doing so. Before I move on, are there any questions on this section?
Nothing has, I have a couple, but I think I might want to save them for the end. And we have
Cool.
nothing else coming up in the chat box right now.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to move on. So I was interested in how some of these family factors were used in legal decision making. So does all of this kind of information about the family, does it factor into legal decision making? And so for this portion of the study, I used probation officer intake interview assessment form. So the first step, one of the first steps after a youth is arrested is that they have to do an intake interview. And this looks different in different jurisdictions, so I'm generalizing. But most of the time, the youth and his or her parent sit down with a probation officer and they go through an exhaustive, it's usually pretty long, they go through this intake interview. Some places have a more structured intake interview that might include a risk needs assessment. Some places might have created their own just kind of checklist. And so I'm speaking broadly here. But in this particular sample, the way that the intake interview assessment worked was youth were able to receive 3 different types of sanctions. The first was relatively minor. It's called a sanction and dismiss. So if this is the way that probation decides to proceed with the youth's case, then what that means is essentially the charges will be dropped, the case will be dismissed if the youth does a light sanction, such as maybe writing a letter of apology or meeting with the victim in a restorative justice type model. And that happened to about 15% of the sample. Moving up in severity of sanction, about 45% of kids were diverted from the court. So this meant that their case was handled at probation, but they were on probation. So they had an assigned probation officer, they had probation requirements that they had to complete for a length of time, usually about 6 months, but they never actually went in front of a judge. They weren't incarcerated or held in detention for any amount of time. They were diverted from the court and their case was handled at probation. Oops. And for about 40% of youth, they got the strictest sanction, which was having their case sent to the DA. So I described this earlier as formal processing. And in this case, then the Department of Probation says, I'd like to send this case to the district attorney. The DA says, yes, this should go in front of a judge. The judge says, yes, I agree. This is a more serious case. And so for this more serious sanction, youth are in front of a judge and they might serve some time in detention. They might be on probation. They might be on more intensive supervision probation. They might be on probation for longer, et cetera. So those are the 3 categories that I'm going to be talking about in terms of how a youth case can be handled in this particular sample. So we were interested in what predicts these processing decisions. How are youth sorted into these boxes? And past literature has said that there are a lot of legal factors that go into this decision making. Prior offending history. If this is a repeat offender, probably you're going to get a harsher sanction. But remember, our study is all first-time offenders, so our study design constrains that. Offense severity, that's also a way, so you are not going to get a sanction and dismiss if you have committed a forcible rape or murder. But that's also constrained by our study design. Remember I said that we only selected for those low to moderate level offenses that we knew were kind of a coin flip as far as how they'd be processed. If you've engaged in a violent offense, then you're more likely to be sanctioned more harshly. And so we used, whether it was a person offense, such as assault and battery, as a covariate in the models I'll show you. Past research also suggests that there are some extra legal factors that factor into decision making. At the individual level, these are things like age and unfortunately race. And so we use these as covariates in the model that we created. However, no previous research had looked at what we were interested in, which was the context level. So this is an extra legal factor. It's nothing to do with the case, and it's not an individual characteristic. Rather, we're talking about the home environment in general. So this is something that the youth might not have any control over and is outside of the legal facts of their case, but we hypothesized might have something to do with the way that the case was processed. And so what we found was that when the probation officer marked that the home environment was considered dysfunctional, I know I'll get questions, what does that mean? We don't know. That's just a checkbox on the intake assessment reform. When we asked probation officers, they would say, oh, you know, it's when the home's dysfunctional. So at least it's ecologically valid. We're using their assessment of whether the home is dysfunctional. But when youth had a home environment that the probation officer considered dysfunctional, the case was more likely to be sent to the DA to receive any of these lower sanctions. And the same was true, this is really interesting to me, when the parent said that they disapproved of the youth's friends. And this is one of those interesting cases of probation officers and parents just not really speaking the same language. So what the parents would hear when the probation officer would ask, you know, do you like your kid's friends? Parents would hear, this is a great chance for me to make my kid look good. And they would say 9 times out of 10, you know, he's in with a bad crowd. This is not my son. He just has the wrong friends. It's all the friends. It's not my kid, because they thought that that would be exculpatory. But what probation officers are hearing is, oh man, delinquent peer group, that's a huge risk factor for continued delinquency. I wonder if this kid's in a gang. This sounds to me like the parents have no control over their child because they're letting their child hang out with these friends that, you know, are bad friends. So while the parents were trying to help their kids look better, what the probation officers were hearing was a series of risk factors. So when the parents told the intake officer that they disapproved of their child's friends, the case was also more likely to be sent to the DA than to be diverted or to receive that light sanction and dismiss. So does this matter? Does it matter the way that youth cases are processed in terms of their future offending? Well, what we found was when we asked the youth to self-report their offending, we found that self-reported offending was equal among all 3 types of sanctions. So the kids in each of these groups said that they were offending at the same level. However, kids who had been sent to the DA were about 3.5 times more likely than kids who were diverted, and about almost 10 times more likely than kids who got the sanction and dismiss to be rearrested. So even though these kids self-report engaging in the same illegal behavior at the same level, those kids who had this stricter sanction were more likely to get caught because they had come to the attention of law enforcement. They were already kind of a person that was known to the justice system in their local area. And so we argue that that was what made them more likely to be arrested, not the fact that they were engaging in the behavior, because that was happening equally across groups. And remember, we controlled for a lot of the other factors that might be associated with likelihood of getting rearrested. Questions about this section? I want to make sure I'm stopping for questions.
There aren't any in the chat box.
Cool. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the last section here, which is essentially the opposite direction. So how youth reoffending affects the family context. So what do we know? What have we covered so far? So far, we've covered that arrest is a stressful experience. It necessitates parental support. Parents aren't always equipped to be able to offer that support, but that's certainly our hope that we can make them more able. And we also know that in general, adolescents rely instrumentally and emotionally on their parents. So basically, we know a lot about this direction. We know a lot about how the family context can inform what a youth justice system experience is like, their reoffending behavior, etc. But what we don't know is very much about the opposite direction. So how contact with the justice system affects that parent-child relationship or the dynamic within the family. And so I'm interested in how youth reoffending, so continued contact with the justice system, is associated with a few different aspects of this parent-child relationship over time. So first, I'm going to talk about relationship quality, which I've operationalized here as warmth and hostility. So relationship warmth might be things like how often does your mom or how often does your son tell you that he or she loves you, help you do something that's important to you, etc. So those are behaviors we would consider warm behaviors. Both youth and moms self-reported on this. Hostility is not exactly antithetical to warmth. So hostility is things like how often does your mom or does your son scream and yell at you, hit or throw things at you, call you names or swear at you, etc. So it's possible for a relationship to be both warm and hostile, or to be cold but non-hostile. So these aren't exactly diametrically opposed. However, they usually kind of fit together such that a warmer relationship is also usually less hostile. But I'm going to present them separately because we know that they're not exactly diametrically opposed. So remember that the mother's data was collected at baseline and then 3 years later. And I was interested in the extent to which these markers of relationship quality, warmth, and hostility changed over those 3 years. And what we found was a great deal of variability. So when looking at relationship warmth, a little bit more than half of moms said that their relationship with their son got better, got warmer over time, but a solid close to 40% said actually my relationship has gotten less warm over time, whereas only about 10% said there was no change. For hostility, we saw a similar pattern. So close to half of people said my relationships become less hostile, but about 35% said my relationship has become more hostile, and about 15% said that there hadn't been a change at all in the hostility in the relationship. So there was a great deal of variability here, which kind of came as a surprise. I expected to see more families reporting that there wasn't much of a change over time. So I was interested in the extent to which youth reoffending could explain some changes in warmth and hostility. When I teach juvenile justice, and when I teach the class, I always ask my students to spend some time thinking about how their parents might react if they had been arrested 4 or 5 times, and the extent to which that might eventually start to damage the relationship between the two of them. And so this is what we find. So along the x-axis here, I've got youth reoffending, and on the y-axis, I'm going to report warmth and hostility. I'm just reporting them separately. And so this is controlling for the baseline levels of warmth and hostility that parents and children reported having. And what I'm looking at is that time to that 3 years later warmth and hostility in relation to offending. And what we found was that as youth were reoffending more, as youth were racking up more offenses, relationship warmth went down. And perhaps unsurprisingly, as youth continued to reoffend, relationship hostility increased. So over time, as youth continued to engage in offending behavior, relationship warmth decreased and relationship hostility increased. What was interesting was that age moderated this relationship only for warmth, not for hostility. And so here we're looking at the same x-axis and the same y-axis, except I'm only reporting warmth. So remember, youth were between 13 and 17 when they entered the study. And what we found was that for younger youth, that kind of decline in warmth in response to reoffending was steeper. And so what I want you to take from this is that it's really important to strengthen that parent-child relationship early for young and at-risk youth. And that's because we know that one of the best predictors, I mean, there's decades of research suggesting that one of the best predictors of helping kids get out of crime is having a strong, positive relationship with their parents. So we can see how this might create a downward spiral, right? So as youth continue to reoffend, it damages the very relationship that would have been important to help pull them out of crime. And this seems particularly true for younger youth. So that's could be a great area for intervention. Family therapy or family-based programs are popular in a lot of different juvenile justice systems lately, but it's important to pay attention to some of the age-graded differences in the way that these family-level interventions might be most effective. Questions on this before I move on?
We don't have anything in the chat box.
Cool. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the last little bit for today, and this is aspirations for youth's future. So we're still talking about how youth reoffending affects the family dynamic, the parent-child dynamic. But here I'm talking about expectations for the future. So again, I'm pulling from the education literature, and we know that high parental expectations for the future are associated with greater academic achievement and also greater behavioral health. So youth whose parents have higher expectations for them are more likely to do better in school, more likely to go to college, more likely to stay off of drugs. They also have better mental health outcomes. So we know that parents who have high expectations, that's usually a good thing in terms of some outcomes for their kids. But we also know that adolescents make mistakes. There are stumbling blocks that might affect these parental expectations for the future. And so does goal-disruptive behavior reduce a mother's aspirations or expectations for her son's future? The most goal-disruptive behavior, one of the most I can think of, is getting arrested, because having an arrest history, especially as an adult, can really close some doors. And so I was interested in the extent to which continued delinquency affects mother's expectations and aspirations for her child's future. The way that criminal behavior was measured, this was the predictor, was via self-reported offending, although I'll say that the results were largely similar when looking at arrest. But self-report, as we've said, not all crimes that are committed are caught, and self-report usually gives us more information about what youth are actually involved in. Our outcome variables were aspirations for the future and expectations for the future. And this comes from the perceptions of opportunity scale. So aspirations are things like, how important to you is it that your son do XYZ, whether that's graduate from high school, provide a good home for his family, stay out of trouble with the law, have a good relationship with his future spouse, partner, children, etc. Expectations for the future are a little different. Rather than how important it is, we asked parents, what do you think the chances are that your son will XYZ? And we'd ask the same items. What do you think the chances are that your son will graduate from high school, will stay out of trouble with the law, will provide a good home for his family, etc.? So these are two different scales that are tapping something different that both have to do with the way that parents envision their son's future. Aspirations being what they hope for their sons, and expectations being what they think is realistic for their child to achieve. And of course, demographics we added as covariates, and these were things like youth age and youth race. Oh, and youth prior offending behavior. So what did we find? First of all, 3 years after their child's first arrest, aspirations remained high and stable for all moms, and I'm not saying all as a hyperbole or an exaggeration. Every single mom said for every single item that it was very important to them that their child achieve it. So no matter what it was, both at baseline and 3 years later, every item mom said it was either important or very important. There was no one who chose one of the middle responses or one of the, it's not that important to me. They were high, they were stable. It was like almost a perfect correlation between time 1 and time 2. There was no change at all. But mothers' expectations for what their child could actually achieve were reduced in response to delinquency. So as their youth continued to engage in delinquency and continued to get in trouble, mothers had to adjust their expectations. And so what that means is that we had mothers who would say, it's really important to me that my son go to college, but it's very unlikely that that will actually happen. Or it's really important to me that my son stay out of trouble with the law, but it's very unlikely that that will actually happen, when their children had continued to engage in delinquency. And again, we saw that same moderation by age that we found for relationship warmth. So on the x-axis, as delinquency increased, mothers' expectations at follow-up, so their expectations for their son's futures decreased. So for older youth, yes, delinquency reduced mothers' expectations, but that decline was steeper among younger youth. So particularly for the 13, 14-year-olds who are continuing to get in trouble, mothers really felt as though doors were being closed on what their children could achieve if their 13, 14, 15-year-olds had already racked up multiple offenses or was already engaging in a lot of delinquent behavior. And so just as a summary, mothers' aspirations for their son's success were high and stable. And I want to focus on that because a lot of times when working with law enforcement or probation or various legal actors, a lot of times probation officers or attorneys will mistake parents' frustration with the situation with them not caring about their child's future. So I hear that a lot when I work with legal actors, is they'll say, well, these parents just have given up and they don't care. And that's not true. They might be frustrated. They might be scared, they might be upset, they might feel at the end of their rope, but that doesn't mean that they don't wish great things for their kids. And I think that's something really important to keep in mind when working with families in the juvenile justice system, is that these are parents who want good things for their kids. It's just that they're frustrated and they're scared and they're afraid that it's not going to be able to be possible anymore. Because mothers' expectations for their son's success decline when youth reoffend. And that's exacerbated for the younger youth. My big take-home message, my overall take-home message, as we're kind of nearing the end here, is that juvenile justice system contact and family life are intertwined. So we see that this relationship is reciprocal. There are both factors about the family that affect youth reoffending and justice system processing, but there are also factors related to recidivism that affect what's going on within the family. And so it's impossible to talk about this arrow going only one direction without realizing that it goes the other direction as well. It's impossible not to think about these things as reciprocal. And so my question moving forward, I'm an assistant professor, I'm still building my program of research, and I'm interested in how I can better understand what the needs of families are. because I want to make sure that the research that I'm doing is useful not only to the legal actors that I partner with, but also to the families that I want to make sure have good positive experiences, so that their youth don't have any continued contact with the justice system. So I particularly welcome questions in that regard, or your thoughts and feedback in that regard, how I can better understand what the needs of families are. Before I end, I have to acknowledge the many people who helped make a study of this size possible, particularly the collaborators in the Crossroads study, Beth Kaufman, Paul Frick, and Larry Steinberg, the project coordinators, the research assistants, of course, the families who participate, our generous funding agencies. I'm very grateful for the support that, that each of these individuals or groups bring to the table. And in case you would like to contact me after the talk, I've got my email address. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm new to Twitter, so I'm very excited about Twitter right now. You can also check out the research that comes from my lab, which is the ADJUST lab, the Adolescent Development and the Justice System lab. That's all I've got. So Jessica, if there were any other questions or questions from the chat box that you noticed, I'm happy to engage with those.
Great. Thanks so much, Kate. That was really wonderful. I do have a few questions, but before I jump in with those, I know someone had to log off the call, but we still have a couple people on. I wanted to open, because I tend to talk quite a bit, so I wanted to open it up to the couple people we still have with us to see if you all had any questions or comments or reactions to anything that Kate shared with us. All right, so I'll go ahead and get us started. The first thing, and this kind of ties into the last point that you, first of all, Kate, this was extremely interesting.
Thanks, I'm glad.
A couple of questions just about some of the pieces that came up that you were talking, and then I also have a question that's more just wanting to pull from your expertise to inform some of the work that I'm doing right now. But the first question I had was, I know that throughout most of your models you had race as a covariate in your work, and I'm sure this is a question you get probably rather frequently. But this stuck out to me a lot in looking at race as a covariate, particularly in examining attitudes towards the criminal justice system, and particularly in using a procedural justice lens.
I'm so glad you asked.
And just knowing that folks have very different experiences in the criminal justice system as a function, not so much on necessarily how they self-identify, but their perceived race among criminal justice system actors. So I guess it's kind of like just a broad question. Could you just talk about how race came into play, particularly in looking at folks' experiences and perceptions of the systems, and how the criminal justice system response might look different based on race, and just kind of the role of race in all the work that you've been doing?
Certainly, yeah. So I am really interested in this legal socialization piece, this how do youth develop attitudes toward the justice system. And a lot of that work I do with a collaborator named Adam Fine. He is a criminologist at Arizona State University. So if you're interested in this, he's a good person to look up. And so we have a couple of different papers, either that are already out or that are under review, that are looking at racial and ethnic differences in legal socialization. And so first, what we find is pretty stably, white youth hold higher attitudes toward the justice system than Latino youth, who hold higher attitudes than Black youth, which is probably not a huge surprise based on the way that those groups are often treated by law enforcement or various other legal actors. And what's really interesting, a paper that's under review right now that we have, is that this has been a stable pattern over time, although the racial gap is widening. So the Monitoring the Future study is a nationally representative study of high school kids, so non-offenders, just community high school kids, and it includes some questions that are related to attitudes toward law enforcement. And we've seen, so the study's been running since the 70s, so we have a solid 40 years of data. And so consistently across those 40 years, we've seen this stacked effect where white youth hold pretty positive attitudes, followed by Latino youth, followed by Black youth. But in the past 10 years or so, that gap's really been growing, such that Latino and Black youth have in the past several years shown increasingly negative views toward law enforcement relative to white youth. So that's certainly something, that's a really great point, Jessica. And that's kind of a whole other issue. What was interesting was for the moms, there were fewer differences. In attitudes toward the justice system by race or ethnicity, it would pop up sometimes in some models, but not always. It was less predictable than it was for youth. And I'm not sure if that is a cohort effect, or if it's just the way we ask the questions, or if it has to do with the fact that youth are the ones who are actually having personal interactions with some law enforcement in a way that parents maybe aren't. But that's a great point.
Great. Thank you. That was really wonderful. The second question I had in some ways ties into race, just if we think of race as something that is created by and impacts kind of bigger, broader structures and systems. So when you were talking about structural barriers to parents participating in the criminal justice system, I really appreciated how kind of where the rubber meets the road, all of your recommendations for how we intervene and what we do, we're looking at shifting systems and structures, but I can't help but think about opportunities for misuse of this research to kind of put it at the foot of parents, right? So like when we look at what are the levels at which, what's the unit of analysis in terms of how we're designing our research vis-a-vis the level of potential intervention and kind of where those problems and solutions lie. And so I just wonder if you could, especially from a community psychology perspective, in which we are always wanting to look at kind of systems and context and structures and things like that, if you could talk about, I don't know if this is something that you've grappled with at all, like in thinking about, okay, what does it mean? Like I'm studying the parent-child relationship, but knowing that the problems might exist there, but also the system and structure. So if you could just talk about kind of like those multiple levels and how you maybe guard against misuse or just kind of think about intervention and grapple with those pieces.
Yeah, that's a really great point, and that is something that I struggle with, and so I'm not sure if I'm going to have a great answer here. But yes, it's difficult because often, so this is going to sound really silly and kind of glib, but if you use Facebook and if you follow like a news organization, and the news organization posts on Facebook something about juvenile crime, look at the comments section, because probably 8 out of 10 comments are, where were their parents? What were the parents doing? So as a society, we have the sense that any kind of wrongdoing by a child should be the parent's fault. That's why there are parental responsibility laws that can fine parents or even charge them with a misdemeanor for not monitoring their child well enough, if their child breaks curfew, for example. And so this is a huge, huge problem that we as a society kind of lay all the blame at the feet of parents without understanding the role of systems and the role of some of these more structural barriers. And you're right that I, in a way, contribute to that issue by using parents as the unit of analysis. So I've been at Michigan State for 2 years now. This is the beginning of my 3rd year. Well, actually, we're halfway through. I just can't say that anymore. I have worked really hard at developing partnerships with some of the more structural pieces. So I work with the Ingham County juvenile court system. And so I think that could be a good way to shift that focus and shift the unit of analysis, not just to make sure that those legal actor partners are getting the research and understanding the research, but also so that they're understanding, and the research is understanding the role that some of those broader structural pieces play in youth reoffending. So I don't have a good answer for you, but I agree that is definitely something that's really important to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I thought you did a really nice job of, because this is something I always notice, and I think you did a really nice job in talking about like, what does this mean for the work we do? And it's like the relationships with parents matter, and we need to support them. And like you went right into how we do that. But I think it is a point at which we can get stuck. And like, exactly what you said, right? Like 8 out of 10 comments are about where were the parents, and the parents.
Right. Kind
of bigger, broader issues. Since no one else has jumped in yet, I'm just going to be greedy and ask another question since I have it. So I study system responses to sexual assault. And I've done some work previously with teens, but then I also have a teen study right now that's really looking at the mandated reporting response to sexual assault.
Very cool.
And how teens end up being pulled into both the response through Department of Children and Families, as well as the criminal justice system response, because of how the mandated reporting response works here in Massachusetts. But I'm actually giving a talk in a couple of weeks to forensic nurses. They asked me to come and just talk about adolescent sexual assault. And so I'm planning on really talking about kind of the dynamics, incidence, prevalence, what's different about adolescent sexual assault compared to younger folks and older folks. What do we see in terms of adolescents help seeking post-assault? What do we know about their experiences and systems post-assault? And all of that being said, I'm not a developmental psychologist. I'm talking more about like, what do we know about this? What do we know about systems and things? So I haven't found the very beginning of your talk really helpful for me. So just
good.
As a developmental psychologist, knowing I'm going to train forensic nurses who who are part of the trauma response to sexual assault. I'm going to train them about what it means when a teen walks into their emergency department. From a developmental psychologist lens, what sorts of things do you think I should be sharing with them?
Ooh, great point. Okay, so one of the normative tasks of adolescence is figuring out what is healthy and positive sexual behavior. So adolescence is a time when you're developing your identity, but that includes your sexual identity. So there's a lot of normative developmental exploration that happens during the teenage years in terms of romantic relationships, in terms of sexual relationships, both with yourself and also with other partners. And that is totally normal. Part of the issue is that because youth are sometimes impulsive, because they're really driven by rewards, because peers are very salient, sometimes adolescents can make a decision that they later regret, right? And so in some cases, that might make them more prone to be victims of sexual assaults. But I think what's really tricky from a developmental standpoint, and here's where I don't want to speak beyond what I know, so I'm going to kind of punt on giving you advice here. But what's tricky from a developmental standpoint is disentangling some of this normative experimental behavior that is part of good and positive adolescent sexual development from things that are really problematic and negative experiences. And so that's a little bit more difficult. And that's a little bit of a grayer area. But I think what's important for you to understand from an adolescent development perspective is that identity development surrounding sexuality and romantic relationships is a normative task that adolescents are kind of sorting through and shifting through at this time. So in the case of sexual assault during adolescence, just know that it's happening over the backdrop of this normative time of exploration.
Yeah, okay. I think that's really helpful. And just anecdotally, in some of the cases I've reviewed before, there have been some teens who have talked about going and having the same exam. I mean, for a lot of them, it's their first pelvic exam. And beyond that, though, some of them talked about one of the things that they appreciated from the forensic nurse is they were able to answer basic questions
Yes.
about sexuality and their bodies and things like that, because they haven't been invited to have those conversations before. And so they're there for response to a trauma and a really not good event. That
right. There's this secondary benefit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. All right, we're exactly at 1:30. I might end up following up with you on some stuff. I'm doing some work around procedural justice right now too. So
cool. Please do. Please do.
I'll follow up with you. But thank you so much for your time.
Of course. And thank you very much for the invitation.
Yeah, and for your contact info, because you might end up hearing from more folks once they have a chance to watch your video online, which usually gets posted in about a week. Usually, Jean's really great, many times less than that, but usually it's up and available.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, and hopefully I'll connect with more of you soon.
That sounds great. And just so you know, one of the people on the call just sent in a chat saying, excellent presentation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Okay. Have a great day.
Okay. Take care.
Bye.